I think no small part of the persistence of Pokemon as a franchise is that it is a universe and lore that is really good at begging questions in a way that gets people riled up, but not in a way that deters that curiosity. Like, isn't it weird how we still don't definitively know if humans eat Pokemon flesh in the Pokemon world? Because that's absolutely a harrowing thought, but all things considered, it's practically an unavoidable reality unless Professor Oak spread the goodwill of Beyond Meat to every region. It's as plainly apparent as the bulb on a sore, yet it's not really acknowledged. Similar to, say, the notion of Pokemon mortality. It's abundantly clear Pokemon can die, but it seems rarely acknowledged how frequently this is tied to humans or battles per se. It seems kinda beaten around the bush that Pokemon are mortal, but this has nothing to do with their constant fighting. And this is largely because if you are a guy who lifts one finger to suggest, do you consider how many Butterfree die in Pokemon battles? It's cruel and akin to cockfighting. You're seen as kind of a bummer at best and an annoying gotcha at worst. The flirting equivalent to the sexual harassment of the Pokemon mythos darker Dawn fans in the room, however, have always been ghost-type Pokemon.
Ghost Pokémon are in a vapor form. Their true nature is shrouded in mystery.
I think a lot of the weird questions we have about Pokemon being swept under the rug can be forgiven by the legwork done by ghost types as a staple of the series. Ghost Pokemon as a concept on their face are dark. No, not dark, like dark, but dark. You know what I mean. Being called a ghost makes them pretty explicitly a disembodied spirit, one once of this earth and no longer. Dead, to put it bluntly. Pokemon isn't willing to explain the more explicit points of what happens at Pokemon centers when Pokemon get burned and cut to ribbons and hit a flatline, or if that ever happens, or whether these Pokemon are ever used for food. But Ghost Pokemon are the outlet the minds behind these games have always had for spooky and even harrowing concepts unfettered. You can find plenty of YouTube videos of people reading and compiling dark Pokedex entries. You ever hear this, humdinger?
It is whispered that any child who mistakes Drifloon for a balloon and holds onto it could wind up missing.
You know, that is still pretty creepy. But I hope this video is less a compilation and more a dissection, because I feel ghost Pokemon and their creepy concepts have so much staying power, not simply because they're spooky, but because they pick at the scabs of Pokemon's kid-friendly image, something people are pretty universally fascinated by, frequently tied back not just to how we perceive Pokemon, but how it makes us feel. To illustrate that better, we have to slide all the way back to Generation 1. The only ghost types in Gen 1 are direct evolutionary family members, Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, and they've remained so iconic for good reason. Within the more simplistic design inclinations during the heyday of artists like Ken Sugimori, you have three characters that are symmetrical but full of personality, mischievous but enigmatic, playful but supernatural, bristly but exuberant. Speaking of Sugimori, he called Gengar his favorite Pokemon thanks largely to the fact that he was the easiest to draw. For a long time as a little kid, I had trouble keeping track of what order this line evolved in because all three struck such a distinct image. No one feels like the baby versus the more developed version. To this day, Gengar is kind of the poster boy of ghost types, kinda how I feel Machamp is to fighting types, in that he sneaks into perks like Mega Evolution and Gigantamaxing, when those are usually prioritized for new generation headliners, cause who doesn't want to see a new take on this old classic? Germane to their physically straightforward designs, if you are asked what are Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, the most accurate answer would be that they're shadows. The most everyday ghost-adjacent idea you could fathom. Perfect for the first ever ghost Pokemon. A physical standard ubiquitous and graspable to babies, but endlessly pokeable. Shadows follow you. They're artistically malleable, they can be daunting or come off precocious, and they can be instantly gleaned by looking at these grim, grinning ghouls.
Deep in the night, your shadow cast by a streetlight may suddenly overtake you. It is actually a Gengar running past you, pretending to be your shadow.
Pokemon draw so much appeal because they're pretty easily paralleled to animals. You figure, sure, Krabby lives near the water, like a crab, and defends itself from predators with its pincers, like a crab, and probably tastes amazing in butter, like a... Sorry, that was uncalled for. But it's a harder thing to imagine with ghost types because ghosts aren't real. Well, I don't want to die on a hill I may regret, so let me rephrase that ghosts aren't easily observable. So there's no easy guess as to where Ghastly sleeps, eats, and poops, the way there is for most Pokemon. You'd think that'd make them harder to imprint on than more traditional animal-like creatures, but I find most people have fun with the wiggle room their designs allow, applying big ideas to the scant details we are given. Take arguably the most unfettered Wild West for Pokemon media there ever was. Not fan work of any kind, but the earliest episodes of the Pokemon anime. These were clearly in production before anyone knew Pokemon would be the global phenomenon we know it as today. So the rules of the universe were played really fast and loose. I wonder if I'm the only one who finds it kind of uncanny that there's just normal-ass fish in old Pokemon episodes, or a main character who is a Pokemon that learned to speak human tongue through sheer determination. It feels bizarre to consider, but if you pitched that very same concept that we know Meowth as today, Game Freak would probably shoot the idea down, because there's no credence to content of the games that could follow, and players might be confused. This is one of the best-selling franchises in the entire world we're talking about. It's not something you can mess around with. Which is why oddities like these are so prevalent in the early anime. It was just a time where these characters could be played within wider parameters. Bearing all of that in mind, I feel there's a lot of fresh context surrounding the first appearance of Ghastly in the Pokemon anime, the Ghost of Maiden's Peak. Ghastly is the episode's main antagonist, if he's ultimately a harmless one, using its supernatural powers to prank the main characters. Over the course of the story, Ghastly speaks in full human language, shapeshifts into humans, that of an earthly mongoose to scare Ekans, and creates a middle finger to Arceus called Venustoise that is never mentioned before or after, because fusion is an avenue too Lovecraftian to expose our precious pocket monsters to ever again, I imagine. This episode, I firmly believe, would not happen today, the way it did back in 1997, and the writers of the Pokemon anime largely had that sandbox from the mystery left by Ghastly's strange and mysterious origins. Haunter and Gengar are seen later as iconoclasts lazing around a haunted house, the only Pokemon seen showing a degree of humanity as extended as cracking open a cold one to a new comedy special. Is it because they're dead humans? Has their ageless nature benefited their time to mimic human behavior? Does being shadows mean they've parroted man long enough to go through the motions? It's all pretty plausible, yet Pokemon as a lore delicately leaves a bit to the imagination, and threading that needle goes a really long way for their staying power as popular ghost types.
It strikes at humans from total darkness. Those licked by its cold tongue grow weaker with each passing day until they die.
Holy shit. So, I hope it's pretty clear how ghost types got so monumentally popular among the Pokemon populace. Japanese fans voted Ghost the third most popular type out of the whopping 18 choices, losing out only to Water and Dragon types by margins of a single % of their respective votes. But for all that popularity in a meta sense, Ghost-type Pokemon are less so within the actual narrative of Pokemon. Ghost-type trainers are generally depicted as very methodical and needing a lot of experience to go about their Pokemon of choice, and it's rare a Ghost specialist is an early schmo you take on. Folks like Agatha and Phoebe are heavy hitters saved for the late-game gauntlets like the Elite Four. Green and sprightly trainers don't have what it takes to train the ethereal and powerful ghosts, and they're pretty reasonably frightened by them, so they don't have the in-universe pretty privilege that Pikachu and Togepi do. This is largely the genesis of one of the biggest breakout Pokemon in recent years, Mimikyu, a hidden spirit wearing garbage to pretend it's Pikachu so people will love it.
A lonely Pokemon, it conceals its terrifying appearance beneath an old rag, so it can get closer to people and other Pokemon.
It's plain to see how fans took to this misfit Pokemon like bees to honey. The sort of relatable nature of a Pokemon bent on being adored to the point that it will pretend to be something it isn't. I think an equally dismissed topic of Pokemon is that of rejection. I can't be the only Pokemon trainer, in a manner of speaking, who feels bad rotating Pokemon out of that ever-coveted 6-phase team rotation, as no matter how much I like them, what awaits them is that sort of depressing PC box. And sure, the anime clarifies they're all on a farm when they shift out of the way, but that's what stressed-out parents say about Sparky when they need the truth to elude their children. If you've been a fan of Pokemon long enough, you've felt that twinge of guilt that you swear you'll come back for Weepinbell, it just doesn't make sense to fight a fire gym with him. And then you go back on that promise, and multiple battles go by, and Weepinbell is still gathering digital dust in the PC. And that may be a promise to a series of zeros and ones with a cute design, but likely the same could be said about Baynet.
Baynet generates energy for laying strong curses by sticking pins into its own body. This Pokemon was originally a pitiful plush doll that was thrown away.
Baynet is a good guy doll turned bad, driven by bitter feelings of abandonment that we're all guilty of. You have to admit, when you heard that Pokédex entry, some old toy popped into your head that you feel bad got lost in a move. And that could be any of your old Pokemon, the Gloom you traded for Eradicate for some reason, the Mudkip on your game file your little brother deleted. We as human beings unconsciously assign emotions and agency to objects even when they're lifeless, especially when they're given a face to relate to, which is no small part of why we're drawn to dolls, figures, and digital pocket monsters that fight for us on an electronic plane, only to be stuffed down into a theoretical line of code. Baynet, I feel, represents that common guilt, which frequently manifests into fear of reciprocating karma, also easily conveyed by the aspects of Baynet that tie back to the old cliché of voodoo dolls. The idea Baynet could achieve agency after it was discarded as a toy, and even perhaps pursue its dismissal and vengeance, is a matter unto itself because the idea of Pokemon preying on humans is a huge paradigm shift. Pokemon are generally at mankind's mercy, captured and befriended if in a dynamic that starts with an aggressive chase. Knowing there are Pokemon that seek us make us innately aware of what we don't want to acknowledge, that going after Pokemon begets the risk that you will become the prey. Case in point, Gourgeist.
Large Gourgeist put on the guise of adults, taking the hands of children to lead them to the afterlife.
Gourgeist is the incarnate of that fear of the predatory. Note their resemblance to a universal symbol like jack-o'-lanterns. The way they prey on human trust, specifically of children, to spirit their prey away, by resembling something most children find pleasant and playful. You might even be shocked to read that Pokédex entry associated with Gourgeist in particular, but truly, every kid to go on a Pokemon adventure, however implicitly, is at that same risk, as the mercy of any given Pokemon in the universe is not a given. Hell, you can hit that runaway button all you want within the bounds of the game and you'll be fine. But if you really lived in a world of Pokemon, the likes of Duskull would be all over you like yellow on a Pichu.
Duskull can pass through any wall, no matter how thick it may be. Once this Pokemon chooses a target, it will doggedly pursue the intended victim until the break of dawn.
The Gen 3 ghost types are when the design inclinations of 1 and 2 seems to be left behind. The ghosts in Hoenn are asymmetrical, a little more finely detailed, and more dimly colored. Which isn't to say one approach is better than the other, but it does suit the more morbid lore ideas very nicely.
Dusclop's body is completely hollow. There is nothing at all inside. It's said that its body is like a black hole. This Pokémon will absorb anything into its body, but nothing will ever come back out.
All of this may beg the question, specifically around Pokémon mortality. There's been points of fact in Pokémon stories that revolve around the fact that Pokémon do, without question, die. But for such a young player base, the notion of a Poké afterlife is a really interesting one to entertain. And more than a few Ghost-type Pokémon are fates awaiting Pokémon we already know, once they are past tense. The newly added form of Primeape, Annihilate, is described with a lot of mumbo-jumbo about how its rage can no longer be attained in its physical form, which I take to be an E-rated euphemism for a Pokémon with clear hypertension induced by its poor temper, finally buying the farm via some kind of heart-straining meltdown. More forthcoming in its undead origins is Cursola. Corsola was a pretty innocuous coral Pokémon in the Johto region, reinvented with a new variation down the line with ghost typing and a sickly appearance. A very clear allusion to the real-life destruction of our coral reefs. Coral is an invaluable natural resource for marine life, providing food and shelter to a lot of sea creatures. Sadly, humans, as we're wont to do, have engaged in destructive commerce, fishing, and hunting habits that have dwindled our ocean supplies of coral, a toll many sea creatures will not bounce back from, making Cursola, frankly, an incredibly morbid creature conceptually, even by ghost-type standards. Death has been no small part of the lore of Marowak from the beginning. It's said a mother Marowak rarely survives the birth of a baby Cubone, which is why Cubone is known as the Lonely Pokémon, wearing its mother's skull on its head. The Alolan variation of Marowak fully leans into this tidbit, making a ghost-type form of presumably what awaits Marowaks that reach the end of their short time among the living. I do really love how examples like these can take a sort of fantastical Pokémon, like a ghost type, and still pass for connecting and even informative to real life.
Fishermen are terrified of Jellicent. It's rumored to drag them into the sea and steal their lives away.
While it's presented pretty fantastically, Jellicent being so universally feared by circles of sailors in the world of Pokémon is likely a parallel to real-life jellyfish. Most notable, the creature that holds the distinction of the most venomous living thing under the sea, the box jellyfish. Although the number of human deaths related to these invertebrates is rather low, they're still widely feared, and I think the notion of creating a ghost type based around their translucent, see-through appearance and fearsome reputation is one that comes together beautifully. Jellicent is also said to sink ships that wander out too far, a likely reference to the real-life legend of the Bermuda Triangle, where Jellicent builds its palaces of destroyed boats. Ghost Pokémon truly feel like urban legends of the Pokémon world, the way our parents tell us stories to justify small things in our everyday life.
If you build sand mounds when you're playing, destroy them before you go home, or they may get possessed and become Sandygast.
And doesn't that sound like something your parents tell you to make sure you pick up your toys and leave the beach the way you found it? Make sure to reaffirm the sand and don't leave anything behind, or else your castle will turn into a Sandygast and get you. And that begs sort of a fun chicken egg principle in that, are Sandygast actually sandcastles brought to life by spirits, or are they just ground-type Pokemon that look a little like sandcastles, and the people of the Pokemon world made up an old wives' tale when they noticed kids were scared of Sandygast to promote safety and responsibility on the beach?
Leaving leftover black tea unattended is asking for this Pokemon to come along and pour itself into it. turning the tea into a new poltergeist.
Ash, don't leave the fucking tea out. How many times have I told you not to leave the fucking tea out? It takes half a second to rinse it out. You want to attract a poltergeist? You lazy shit. The poltergeist isn't gonna do the fucking dishes for you. Don't you give me, oh, I'm letting it soak. No excuses. Do the goddamn dishes. As frivolous as all of that sounds, I hope it's pretty clear from everything I've talked about so far that ghost types, within the context of Pokemon, mean business.
Through its roots, it exerts control over other trees. A deadly curse falls upon anyone cutting down trees in forests where Trevenant dwell. In homes illuminated by chandelure, instead of lights, funerals were a constant occurrence, or so it said. Folklore has it that on moonless nights, Darkrai will make people see horrific nightmares.
Ghost types are pretty naturally the most bewitching and predatory of Pokemon, befitting their spooky appearances, origins in the ghost stories of myth, and overall imposing inclinations. Which begs the question why human trainers even begin to bother with that. If I came across Pokemon with hobbies like stealing human spirits in the numbers trainers in the games do, I'd probably just stay home with my Granbull. There's so many instances of ghost types arranging human coffins, exploiting us for nourishment, running us out of their territory. Is it a fool's errand to even approach them? That, I think, can be answered by a recent favorite of mine.
This friendly Pokémon doesn't like being alone. Pay Graveyard even the slightest bit of attention, and it will follow you forever.
What a good boy! What a good undead boy! And other lore indicates being around Greavard too long will straight up kill you. It's kind of a tragic paradox. Pokedex entries describe it as head and shoulders above other Pokemon in loyalty, but it's a ghost with creepy aura and ostensibly detrimental effect on humans. I think people who criticize, hey, do Pokemon like being captured? Do they like fighting? Are we oppressing them and making them slaves? I think those notions can be answered by Greavard, who still craves to fight for a human trainer as a spirit. Pokemon is a work of fiction, and maybe someone very young and impressionable can take the wrong idea that it's a game about how animals are here to serve us and can be ripped from their habitat to do our bidding with no repercussions. But Pokemon isn't an example as much as it is wish fulfillment. A lot of people wish they could tame any animal, connect with them emotionally more than we do in real life, and learn from them. But the vast majority of animals are too dangerous and delicate to do that with. And so are Pokemon, but the adventure aspect is the fantasy it gives us. Ghost types, by their Pokedex descriptions, are unfathomably powerful, and sometimes a bit malicious, but they can be captured, socialized, and befriended. I think the appeal of recruiting ghost types isn't just that they're cool as all get out, but it's the only answer you need when someone wonders, are we exploiting Pokemon? These are creatures capable of astral projection, incantations, and curses. Don't you think they'd float away from their trainer if they didn't see you as a friend? The process of weakening a Pokemon and collecting enough gym badges to command it isn't whittling it down physically alone. It's proving your strength and, more or less, winning your opponent over. The cornerstone of Pokemon isn't obedience, it's friendship. Ghost types are the wildest spirits of the Poke universe, and they give truth to the myth of Pokemon agency, displaying intelligence and sentience in spades. We don't need to be worried about them, and we should be proud we've got them in our corner. Training ghost types isn't just a signal you're still in your Hot Topic phase, it's a stepping stone that you've mastered and poised some of the world's most mysterious and strong creatures, putting you well on your way to taming God in the endgame of whatever installment you're playing. That's what it means to live in a Pokemon world.